After the United States officially broke away from the British Empire in 1776, its merchant ships were no longer under the protection of the British Navy. Over time, the Barbary pirate states of North Africa started exploiting this by capturing American merchant vessels, enslaving their crews, and forcing the United States to pay tribute. The Barbary corsairs were pirates who primarily based themselves out of the ports of Tunis, Tripoli, and Algiers. While these corsairs were based out of North Africa, they raided West Africa, Brazil, Ireland, Western Britain, and even all the way to northern Iceland. While other European powers found it easier to pay the pirates a preventative tribute than to go to war with them, the United States simply could not afford this tribute. The Barbary states were nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, but in practice operated independently of the government in Istanbul. In 1785, the US disbanded its continental navy, and thus left its civilians unprotected in the Mediterranean Ocean. In July of 1785, two American ships, the schooner Maria and the Dolphin, were captured by Algerian pirates, who forced the survivors into slavery and set their ransom at $60,000. Thomas Jefferson, then the minister to France, attempted to form a coalition of other European naval powers to defeat Algiers, but this attempt ended in failure. So the United States eventually paid $40,000 to free the enslaved merchants in 1791. In 1795, the US sent diplomats to North Africa and successfully built treaties with Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. However, by 1797, the United States had paid $1 million in tribute, or about a fifth of the annual federal budget. And by 1799, the US was behind on payments to the Barbary states by around $300,000. The American people were heavily against these tributes, as they thought the money would be better used to build a navy to defend their merchant vessels from the Barbary pirates. And the American people made their voices heard in the 1801 election, as they voted for Thomas Jefferson over the incumbent John Adams, partly because Jefferson campaigned against the humiliation of paying tribute to the petty tyrant of Algiers. But now that Jefferson was in office, he had to make good on his promises. Citing that the United States was behind on its tributary payments, the Pasha of Tripoli, Yusef Karamanli, increased the expected tribute from the United States. But Thomas Jefferson, opposed to paying any tribute at all, decided to face the Barbary corsairs militarily. So on May 13, 1801, President Thomas Jefferson ordered a squadron led by Commodore Richard Dale to blockade the port of Tripoli and attack any interfering Barbary ship. On August 1, 1801, the USS Enterprise, commanded by Lieutenant Andrew Sterett, encountered a Tripolitan ship while en route to Malta for a water resupply and approached. The Enterprise at the time was flying British colors to go undetected. Captain Sterett of the Enterprise interrogated the commander of the Tripolitan ship on the object of its cruise, to which he replied that he had came out to cruise after the Americans and that he lamented that he had not come into contact with them. At that exact moment, Captain Sterett discharged a volley of musketry, to which the Tripolitan returned fire. The Tripolitan cruiser attempted to board the Enterprise 3 times, but was repulsed every single time. The Tripolitan cruiser also feigned surrender by striking its colors 3 times, to which it resumed battle each time. After the third feigned surrender, Captain Sterett gave orders to sink the Tripolitan. During this onslaught, the Tripolitan was gravely damaged, and when the Tripolitans finally begged for mercy, Captain Sterett decided to show clemency to his enemies. Of the 80 men on board the Tripolitan ship, 20 were killed and 30 were injured, while not a single soldier aboard the Enterprise was wounded. This American victory was so astounding that it gave America a strong resolve to completely defeat the Barbary states. On October 31, 1803, off the coast of Tripoli, the USS Philadelphia, accompanied by the USS Vixen, was chasing down a Tripolitan naval ship. However, the Americans were unfamiliar with the terrain, and the USS Philadelphia ran aground on an uncharted reef. Captain William Bainbridge tried to refloat the vessel, but strong winds and rising waves drove the Philadelphia further aground. With no other options and in the best interests of his men, Captain Bainbridge surrendered to the Tripolitans. Captain William Bainbridge and his entire crew were enslaved by the Pasha of Tripoli as war captives. This defeat was disastrous to the war effort, as the vessel was potentially usable by the state of Tripoli. At the harbor of Tripoli, the Barbary corsairs had finally managed to refloat the USS Philadelphia on November 2nd of 1803. However, the Bey of Tripoli decided he had too few soldiers to man the Philadelphia. The US believed that the Philadelphia was a prize too great to fall into enemy hands, so they devised a plan to either recapture or destroy it. On February 16, 1804, under the cover of nightfall, a young Lieutenant Stephen Decatur sailed the Intrepid into Tripoli harbor with 83 men under the guise that the ship had lost all of its anchors in a storm and needed safe harbor. Decatur tied the Intrepid next to the Philadelphia, and the Americans boarded the captured ship. After making sure it wasn't seaworthy, Decatur's men set the USS Philadelphia ablaze. While executing this plan, Decatur's force came under fire from a garrison that was set to defend the Philadelphia, but escaped. The American raiding party only suffered one wounded soldier and inflicted more than 20 casualties on Tripoli. On August 3, 1804, Commodore Edward Preble commanded his Mediterranean squadron to launch the first of a series of bombardments on the harbor of Tripoli with the goal of destroying the defending batteries and sinking enemy ships. Preble dispatched 6 gunboats under the command of Stephen Decatur to engage Tripoli's smaller vessels in the shallow coastal waters. Preble also deployed 2 bomb catches to blast the capital city. The Tripolitans had formed a flotilla of gunboats and smaller vessels. During the battle, Stephen Decatur moved to board and capture a Tripolitan gunboat, and in a heavy battle, he was able to subdue the crew. After the capture, Decatur was notified that his brother, James Decatur, had been killed in battle. Furiously, Decatur chased down the enemy ship and engaged it. Although his crew was badly injured and fighting at a 2-to-1 disadvantage, Decatur claimed his second victory of the day after a bloody engagement. However, Decatur's success did little to turn the tide of the battle, as the 2 catches did minimal damage to the city. On September 1st, 1804, the USS Intrepid was fitted as a floating volcano and would be sent towards the Corsair fleet and the walls of Tripoli to detonate in a massive explosion. Lieutenant Richard Summers assumed command of the Intrepid and enlisted 12 volunteers. At 8 p.m., the Intrepid began its final voyage. Joining it were the USS Argus, Vixen, and Nautilus, serving as escorts to pick up the returning crew from their mission. As the Intrepid approached Tripoli, it was spotted and fired upon by carronades from the overlooking shore batteries, and shortly after, the Intrepid erupted in a massive explosion, killing everyone on board. The aiding vessels, not knowing that it had exploded early, remained at sea all night, waiting for the volunteers to return. It became apparent to Commodore Preble that besieging Tripoli was becoming too deadly and costly, so he decided to look for another strategy. The leader of Tripoli, Pasha Yusuf Karamanli, held a strong grip over Tripoli. But to become leader of Tripoli, Yusuf Karamanli deposed his brother Hamet Karamanli, who was then exiled to Alexandria. William Eaton, who had returned to the Mediterranean Sea as the naval agent to the Barbary states, had been granted permission from the American government and Thomas Jefferson to back Hamet Karamanli as the rightful heir to the throne of Tripoli. Eaton sailed to Alexandria and gave his proposal to Hamet, who accepted. Eaton was given a small detachment of 7 Marines commanded by Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon. Hamet Karamanli and William Eaton recruited 400 Greek and Arab mercenaries who would join the fight against Tripoli. Eaton would receive naval support on his march from the U.S. Mediterranean Squadron, including the USS Nautilus, Hornet, and Argus. On March 8, 1805, Eaton led his forces on a 500-mile forced march westward across the Libyan desert from Alexandria. Their objective was to capture the port city of Derna. Internal cohesion was extremely low in this army, as the Ottoman Muslims and Greek Christians had many quarrels on their trek. Along the march, Eaton dealt with many attempted mutinies, but was able to quell the majority of them. Eaton finally arrived near Derna in late April of 1804 and devised his plan for the invasion of Derna. On the morning of April 26, 1805, Eaton sent a letter to Mustafa Bey, the Ottoman governor of Derna, to ask for safe passage and supplies. However, he knew the proposal would probably be rejected. Mustafa Bey replied, "My head or yours." On April 27th, the USS Argus sent a cannon to Eaton's unit for the attack. The Mediterranean squadron then bombarded Derna for approximately 1 hour. During this bombardment, Eaton divided his force into 2 units. Hamet Karamanli would lead the Arab mercenaries southwest to cut off the road to Tripoli. Then they would attack the city's left flank and storm the weakly defended governor's palace. Eaton, with the rest of his mercenaries and marines, would attack the harbor fortress. The attack began at 2:45 p.m., with Lieutenant O'Bannon leading the advance. The harbor defenses were heavily reinforced and temporarily halted the attackers. However, the Arab mercenaries were able to enter unopposed in the western section of the city. Eaton's unit became hesitant under fire, so he decided the only way to regain the initiative was to charge. While leading the charge, Eaton was shot in the wrist and seriously injured, but charged on regardless. The Mediterranean squadron halted their bombardment to allow Eaton's force to continue. O'Bannon, with his marines and Greek mercenaries, took the harbor fortress shortly after. O'Bannon then raised the American flag over the fortress, marking the first time the American flag was raised on foreign soil. Many defenders of the city, sandwiched between Hamet's force, were swiftly crushed. By 4 p.m., the fortress of Derna had fallen to America. The US suffered 2 casualties and 3 injuries to its marine detachment, and 9 Greek mercenaries were also killed. Arab mercenary attackers and Tripolitan defender casualties remain unknown. In Tripoli, Yusuf Karamanli was aware that the city had fallen and had sent reinforcements to try to recapture the stronghold. The reinforcement detachment stationed themselves south of Derna. On May 13th, Tripolitan reinforcements ferociously attacked the city and drove Hamet Karamanli's Arab forces to a breaking point, almost recapturing the governor's palace. However, the USS Argus and Eaton's captured batteries decimated the attackers, who finally broke, securing Derna under American control. After Derna, Eaton planned to march on Tripoli in the following months. While he was en route, he was informed of the treaty signed between Tobias Lear of the US and Yusuf Karamanli, which brought an end to hostilities. America agreed to pay a final ransom of $60,000 for the 297 enslaved sailors of the USS Philadelphia, and in exchange, 89 Tripolitan prisoners held by the US were released. The treaty explicitly said America would have to pay no further tribute. America also agreed to lift its naval blockade of Tripoli, ending the 4 Years' War. Although America neutralized Tripolitania, the Regency of Algiers continued to extract tributary payments from America, and it remained a powerful piracy state during the following years. But the new Dey of Algiers, Haji Ali, rejected an American tributary payment as insufficient and declared war. A few weeks later, Algerian corsairs captured an American merchant ship. This Algerian attack was designed by the British Empire and Algiers to coincide with the beginning of the War of 1812 between America and the British Empire. This allowed Algiers to attack American merchant ships unpunished, as the British raised a blockade of the Atlantic Ocean, and America was occupied fighting Britain. When the War of 1812 concluded in 1815, President James Madison asked Congress to declare war on Algiers. Congress did not officially declare war on Algiers, but did grant the use of the US Navy to protect American interests and seize Algerian assets. In May of 1815, Commodore Stephen Decatur led a 10-ship squadron to Algiers, with an even larger force to follow. Decatur reached the Strait of Gibraltar on June 15, 1815, and after learning that several Algerine cruisers had crossed the Strait of Gibraltar a few days before he did, Decatur decided to give chase and cut them off before they reached Algiers. Decatur encountered the 46-gun Mashuda, captained by Admiral Rais Hamadou off Cape Gata, Spain. The Americans heavily outnumbered the Algerines 9 ships to 1, so Hamadou tried to flee to the port of Algiers but was quickly overtaken by the Americans. Noticing that his options were limited, Hamadou next tried to sail to a neutral Spanish port along the coast. The USS Constellation and Ontario were able to close in and blast the Algerine flagship. The Algerines were forced to resort to musket fire at such close range. At the same time, Commodore Decatur positioned his flagship, the Guerriere, broadside to the Mashuda and launched a devastating blast, crippling the Mashuda and killing Hamadou in the onslaught. After this, Decatur expected the Algerines to surrender, but instead, the remaining men continued hopelessly firing muskets until the USS Epervier fired 9 more broadsides at the Mashuda, forcing an Algerine surrender. During the battle, the Americans suffered 10 casualties with 30 wounded, while the Algerines suffered 30 casualties with 406 prisoners. 2 days later, Decatur sighted the Algerine ship Estedio and chased it into shoal waters off Cape Palos. Fearing his vessels would run aground, Decatur sent his smaller vessels, the USS Epervier, Spark, Torch, and Spitfire, to deal with the enemy. And after a fierce 2.5-hour firefight, the Algerines began abandoning their sinking vessel and fleeing towards the shore. The 4 American vessels fired and sunk the escaping boats, forcing the surrender of the remaining crew. Fresh off 2 massive victories, Decatur sailed triumphantly into the port of Algiers and forced de Omar Aga into terms. In the treaty with Algiers, America would cease paying tribute to Algiers under all circumstances. All American prisoners held by Algiers were freed without ransom. De Omar Aga agreed to pay $10,000 as compensation for stolen property during previous conflicts. It was after these 2 wars that America had proved that the Barbary states could be easily dealt with by European navies. The Regency of Algiers declined in power and influence until 1830, when Algiers was invaded and colonized by France. America's victories in the Barbary Wars proved to the world that America could defend its sovereignty and assets around the world.